Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour. I am happy to be back in Pristina to examine important global and local developments that affect the lives of all Kosovars. And today I will be discussing some important national and security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski hot seat, Albin Kurti, leader of Vetëvendosja and a member of the Kosova Assembly. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled Serbia's Plans for Kosova. Serbia's government may be planning to eliminate Kosovo's statehood by supporting a Greater Albanian project. Since the breakup of Yugoslavia, officials in Belgrade have toyed with various solutions that would permanently settle relations between Serbs and Albanians and finally eliminate the so-called Kosova question. The current focus on territorial partition can be viewed in this perspective. All Serbian leaders since Slobodan Milosevic have resisted negotiating with the authorities in Pristina and only acquiesced because of pressure from the EU and the US. They prefer to deal with Tirana, and in bypassing Pristina, they deliberately seek to undercut the legitimacy of the Kosovo state and its officials. Belgrade will consider almost any option to avoid recognizing Kosovo as an independent state. Having failed to reintegrate the territory into Serbia or to disqualify Kosovo on the international arena, partitioning Kosovo and merging most of the country with Albania could achieve several objectives. First, for domestic consumption, the government can claim that Serbia has actually benefited by gaining Serb majority areas without recognizing Kosovo's right to exist. Such border changes would enable Serbs to focus on the future partition of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Greater Serbia project would have received its most significant boost since the demise of Milosevic. Second, for an EU audience, Belgrade can claim a breakthrough in stabilizing the Balkans by forging a lasting Belgrade-Tirana compact. This would help the government in its bid towards EU membership. And third, negotiations for a Belgrade-Tirana accord could serve an additional objective, even if they fail, by provoking rifts between Albania and Kosovo. An accord between Belgrade and Tirana over Pristina's head could marginalize Kosovo's leaders and weaken Kosovo's international position. The new state would be viewed as a mere province of Albania rather than an equal partner. Support in Pristina for a loose confederation between Albania and Kosovo, or a merger through an EU-driven process that dissolves borders, does not envisage outright annexation. In an idyllic world, Albania, Kosovo and Serbia would move towards a common future in the European Union where borders would cease to be significant markers of ethnic exclusivity. But the region is far from idyllic, and the wider Europe itself is now rocked by greater demands for ethnic borders. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with Albin Kurti, leader of the Movement for Self-Determination, Vetëvendosja, and a member of the Kosovo Assembly. Thank you, Albin, for joining me on the show. Pleasure to have you.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
This is actually a good opportunity, because I haven't had you for a while, a good opportunity to get your views and opposition party perspectives on the range of political and policy questions. Both domestic and foreign. So let's start with domestic questions. And the big sort of general question, before we get to specifics, how do you assess the performance of the current government coalition since the last national elections?
We have a minority government which does not have 61 MPs to support its decisions. But likewise, we as opposition, we do not have 61 MPs to overthrow it. Mm-hmm. Minority government is not something that you desire in a parliamentarian and democratic republic, and that's why we are touring around the country in order to mobilize people and to make our opposition more active and to end up with a motion of no confidence and have early elections. Every day we have different scandals of corruption. This is a huge government which has 23 ministers, over 80 deputy ministers, 5 deputy prime ministers and hundreds of advisors. And definitely it exists for itself. We have a weak state and an enormous government, and this should change. And I believe that from capital investments which are focused on asphalt, on these expensive highways, we should direct our capital investments towards labor-intensive sectors of economy and provide jobs for especially young women and men of our country.
I want to come back specifically to some of the economic questions that you raise and the corruption question, but in terms of the politics, how do you see the role of the political opposition at this time? Is it simply criticism of government failures, or are you putting forward very concrete proposals against what the government is doing?
Movement for Self-Determination and Democratic League of Kosovo are the two biggest Albanian parties in Kosovo, and they are in opposition. Prime Minister of Kosovo has more parties in his governing coalition than he has MPs of his party in the assembly. So, in a way, this government exists to prevent opposition as majority taking office. That's why we think that our institutions are not really representing the will and the interests of the people. And we are cooperating with LDK on all the topics within the parliament and sometimes also outside of it.
Is this a tactical coalition, or do you coincide in terms of policy?
I think it's tactical and strategic. And in some levels, it's also principled. Because even though we have differences at present and problems from the past, the situation in Kosovo is quite grave, so we can afford ourselves not to cooperate with each other. And I think that now LDK is undergoing internal elections, and once this is over, our cooperation will intensify. For my taste and belief, I think we should have cooperated much more than we do, but perhaps this is also a difference in the characters of our two parties.
Well, I was going to say about the character of your party in the past, less so now, I suppose. You've been criticized for some of your, let's say, unorthodox and sometimes disruptive tactics in parliament and in street politics and so on. Have you evolved in some respects, do you see, over the past few years, and if so, how?
Well, of course, during these years we have changed our strategy, but not our concept and our aim. So we added new means to what we're doing. We got rid of some old means as well. But now I think some of the dangers of the past are not as acute as they were. For example, association of Serb-majority municipalities, which would lead to some sort of Bosnization of our republic, is not there. And likewise, we are much bigger now. In polls, we are very strong, better than ever, and we really foresee that they can delay next government led by our movement, but they cannot stop it altogether as they think.
Let me go back to your support, because of the split, there was a split in your party, I think it was about a year ago or so. Has that affected public support, or has it actually gone up since then?
Well, not really. What we have in common with those who left the movement is that none of us believed how strong and powerful our movement was. So now we are doing very well in polls, while they cannot by any means pass the threshold. So I think people of Kosovo knew very well that those who left, it was not for any principled reason. And what I can say is that they've added us some political experience, and they removed for themselves people's support.
In terms of the constituencies, which sectors of Kosovo society do you benefit most from in terms of support, both regionally and demographically?
It is very interesting that we do not have any kind of place where we are particularly strong or where we're particularly weak.
No sort of base.
Yes, our support is quite uniform. But one could say that among youth, women, diaspora, and middle class, we are prominent. So rather I can speak of social strata of the society that support us more than of geographical locations as our constituencies.
But you're actively campaigning to recruit, particularly amongst young people, I would imagine.
Yes, because average in Kosovo is anyway 30 years old. For example, in Germany is 48. So we are forced to work more with young women and men. And it is them who suffers most, I think.
How many new, out of interest, I haven't researched this, how many new members of the electorate are coming on the rolls next election?
Well, I think that it's over 100,000 every
cycle.
Every cycle. And majority of them, they vote for our movement, just like diaspora. And now the support among women for our movement is increasing likewise.
Do you favor early general elections?
Of course, yeah. I would like to have them as early as yesterday. But I really think that this year, 2019, will become an election year. And this time we're not just going to come out first, but also govern. And I think that the chances that this year we're not going to have elections are much lower than we are going to have them.
And will you go in coalition with LDK for the elections, or on your own and wait to see how it plays out?
It's too early to say now. It depends from our future negotiations about program. But I think that many people of Kosovo and membership within our parties, two political subjects, desire that.
So we can expect early elections, do you think? Do you think there's support across the political spectrum for early elections? Presumably not in government circles at this
Yes,
point.
I think that they know that they are in the last mandate. Prime Minister Haradinaj knows that he will never ever become again Prime Minister, likewise President Thaci. So that's why they want to stretch as long as possible this mandate, because they know that they won't have another.
Let's turn to economics. What are your views? Let's do a number of questions. First of all, privatization. Just so we're clear, what are your views of the privatization process? Are you sort of state socialist in terms of your prescriptions, as some have depicted you? Or are you sort of for a more open, transparent privatization process?
Perhaps from an extreme right-wing position, I seem as a socialist. But this speaks rather for that position than for me. We are not against privatization per se, but we think that we should be careful what to privatize, when to privatize, to whom to sell, how much to privatize, and so on. What we have been advocating since the year 2017 is creation of a sovereign fund where publicly owned enterprises would take over from the government, because out of 17 of them, only 3 operate without losses. And socially owned enterprises to take them from the Kosovo Privatization Agency and unite them together and restructure in the sovereign fund, where the chief of sovereign fund would report directly to the parliament and would be somebody who is outside of political parties. I think it would be best to bring him or her from diaspora, an expert on international markets and world finances, and run them as a successful business, and not continue with this brutal, abusive privatization that we have seen throughout these 15, 16 years, but to sell shares and turn our diaspora into a stakeholder of our economic development, and not merely through their remittances to have them as a factor for survival of our population, because every third Kosovar is a citizen of Kosovo, but not resident of Kosovo. They live abroad. So this fragile social peace that you see in Kosovo is thanks to our diaspora. But we have a huge trade deficit, which amounts to 1/3 of our GDP. So it is important that money which comes from our diaspora, which is like over 1 billion euros per year, while the state budget is 2 billion euros, has to become an economic factor. And sovereign fund is the right way to go forward. And I know that in Eastern Europe, including Slovenia, they have done such solutions. The other side of future economic development is development bank. We need some development bank which would lower interest rates, and the grace periods when you start to pay would increase to several years. Because with these commercial banks that we have, where interest on deposits is 1%, and interest rates are up to 7%, our small and medium enterprises cannot prosper. For example, average salary in Kosovo is in public sector, it's over 500 euros, and in private sector it's only 350. And in the last 10 years, it increased only for 15 euros. So we have to boost private sector. And for this, we need this development bank, which would help business.
So you're for boosting small and medium-sized business, basically, in Kosovo, expanding business development. What would you do with those businesses that have already been privatized, but privatized in the way that you have criticized, that have favored a few?
Well, we have to see what would be the cost to go back in time. If there has been constitution or law violations or human rights violations or violations on the criterias, then we would have to really investigate that. But if the cost of rolling back privatization would be too high, of course we wouldn't do it. We would have to find another solution, like a structural solution rather than a legal one, where we would like get sucked up into endless investigations. So it is important to see what we can save, but also it is important to bring these together and to restructure them within the sovereign fund. Government has not been useful because they have, if they did not privatize publicly owned enterprises from outside through privatization process, they did it internally through nepotism by positioning all party militants into management and by employing their family members. So it is much better to take out these publicly owned enterprises from the hands of the government altogether and put in the sovereign fund. Government has a lot of work to do anyway. So let it not deal with the publicly owned enterprises.
Which country has such sovereign funds that you would want to model Kosovo's practice?
Well, it is very important what do you do during the transition from socialist to capitalist model. And we didn't do it well, I think. When UNMIK arrived in Kosovo, they said, you have nothing, you have to sell everything. And we have to go from this extreme approach to a more sophisticated one. And Slovenia did this. So, of course, you will sell some of the enterprises, but perhaps think maybe you can sell only 30% or 49%. And prior to selling your assets as if they are a burden to you, try to buy new management. Because sometimes government is not a good manager. Maybe you need a private management team or
I've never heard the socialists say the government is not a good manager. So
yeah, well, I think state and government can be good owners, but not necessarily good managers. So it's fine to buy new management while the assets are property of Republic of Kosovo. So I believe that all publicly owned enterprises and private enterprises can compete in a common market in a democratic country.
So would you, out of interest, again, you don't want to be confined by terminology, but we have increasingly in America now, with elections coming up, this split in the Democratic Party between the moderates and the progressives. Would you consider yourself as a progressive in the American sense, in terms of your economic and social prescriptions?
Well, I must say I'm quite heterodox in this way. I really think it depends a lot from the peculiarities of the country where you need to do economic development. I don't have a universal formula. So in this sense, I don't belong to those who think that economy is a proper science. You know, I think there's a lot of, you must have on one hand, a kind of artistic approach where you create things. And on the other hand, it has a lot of anthropological elements that it depends very much from the culture of the people, from the state of the economy, and so on. So I really cannot say.
The level of development and
yes,
so forth.
It's, sometimes it's not good to compare yourself with another country, but rather with a different time in another country.
Going back to what you were saying earlier about how senior positions are dispensed, how companies are sold and so forth, would you say the level of corruption in Kosovo is higher than it was at independence? 11 years ago? How does it compare?
Yes, it did increase. And you can see that this year the budget deficit is amounting to $500 million, while the public debt is not that high, but is fast increasing. And now internal and external public debt is over $1 billion. And most of it went for the salary increase, which was promised during election campaign of the ruling coalition, and for asphalt, for these expensive highways. I think that infrastructure is a carrier of economic development, but is not by itself economic development. Energy and good roads are necessary, but not sufficient. So corruption increased because of this so-called tenderomania, where certain businesses from the government courts, it's not King's Court, it's government courts, which win regularly all the tenders, and they pay back to these political parties by financing their campaigns and their organizations. So perhaps Berlusconi is much more corrupted, but if you put together all his mansions, yachts, football clubs and TV stations, it does not amount to 1% of the budget of Italy, while our corrupted leaders, they compete with the budget. So relatively speaking, their crime is higher, and especially because they were stealing in this poor country. And I think that here the weakest link is basically the prosecution. They really failed us. And every day you have reports in the media of different corruption things happening within our institutions, and you have the report of National Office of the Auditor, and prosecution doesn't act. Prime Minister chased one of the prosecutors because he was about to investigate something that he did, namely this veteran lists, which were boosted 3 times than they should be in reality. And none of the other prosecutors spoke to defend his colleague, so, or their colleague. So it's really sad. And I think that prosecution has become our weakest link, and big changes are needed there.
So let's say every politician talks about rooting out corruption or fighting corruption, combating corruption, while out of office. But realistically speaking, what can be done? You mentioned one, the judicial reform. How would you reform the judiciary in such a way and in such a speed that this process can be accelerated?
It is important to increase the number of prosecutors and judges, but it is also important to lead by example. We must produce our local Elliot Ness. It's of utter importance. Elliot Ness is not going to come from EOLEX. Elliot Ness will be an Albanian here. And
somebody untouchable.
Yes, we need a local Elliot Ness. And I think that's doable, but they must be free out of executive branch, which is not the case. Nowadays, you can see our ministers, our prime minister, with armored vehicles and a dozen of bodyguards, but none of the prosecutors or judges are having them. They are drinking coffee in Mother Teresa Street now that we're talking here, without any concern, because they did no harm to any mafia guy. So I think it's important to have judges and prosecutors with SWAT teams and with bulletproof vests, people who are going to fight corruption. And finally, in the next government, the most famous person in Kosovo should be next chief prosecutor, and not anymore lawyers who defend criminals or ministers for that matter.
Are there any examples from neighboring countries that you would seek to emulate in terms of combating corruption, declaring assets, and what's been happening in Albania, for instance, recently?
Well, we need vetting process, reform of judiciary, but likewise we need vetting process and reform of security sector as well. On the other hand, Croatia is a good example. They've put their prime minister behind the bar, but I think that the path toward EU helped them a lot. This is why I believe that our president and our prime minister actually do not like Kosovo progressing toward the EU. Because in that way, they would have to be more disciplined, rule of law would have to be put in place, more standards and criteria and regulations, so they don't actually want EU integration as they are preaching about. So moving toward EU, having economic development, reform of judiciary together with, combined with some lead by example model with our local eliteness, I think is the winning formula.
And do you have this in your program?
Yes.
Yes. Program?
Yes.
Is this something that other parties agree upon?
Yes, I think when it comes to rule of law, for example, LDK, our partner in opposition, I hope in the government one day as well, is we agree, like totally. When it comes to economic developments, there could be some differences, but I think that's not much that could create problems.
Let's go into another major issue, huge issue, which is youth unemployment and emigration. I suppose the positives are the remittances that the population brings home or sends home back to their families. But it is a brain drain and a brawn drain for Kosovo society, and it has I would say, deleterious impact on Kosovo's economy, on its society, on its institutions. Could you tell us the gravity of the problem?
Yes, I think unemployment is enormous among youth and women. Only 1 in 8 women work. And among youth, also those who work, which is like half of them, 40% of them do not have working contracts. So, because 1/3 of our economy is informal. So one of the future tasks of our government will be also to put all the economy within the law. So enterprises should be free in the market. But again, market should rely on law. And we have the opposite now. Market is not within law. 1/3 of the economy is outside of our institutions and formal legal constraints. But on the other hand, they are not free there because they are basically extended hand of certain government officials. And when it comes to youth, I think that the most important thing is to link education with economy. There is a huge skills gap now. 20,000 young women and men have graduated university in Kosovo, but they don't have a job. And several times higher than this number is the number of those who work but not in their professions. So skills gap, and American Economic Chamber of Kosovo have done a great survey on this, that we need to bridge skills gap if we want to really prosper. For example, a friend of mine has a factory which produces cheese, and they took expert, the engineer for technological production of cheese from Croatia, from Zagreb, because in Kosovo we don't have one. And our young students are graduating diplomacy and international relations, and we barely have 20 embassies around the world. Where to put them? You know, diplomats, they know how to eat cheese with good manners, but they don't know how to produce cheese. We need people who will produce. We are importing elementary goods in our country, from garlic from China and onions from Egypt to hams from Brazil, from pumpkin seeds from Turkey. So even our grandfathers, who were totally illiterate, had this elementary food production in their households. So it is important to start and produce, because once you produce, you plan better, you think deeper, and you build.
So what can be done to attract investment into Kosovo and create jobs, foreign investment in particular?
One is rule of law and property rights. For example, at present, for every economic dispute, the average time of solving them in our judiciary is 658 days. If you see this data, you don't come to Kosovo. And it is important to have efficient rule of law, not just. You need efficient rule of law. And we need our diaspora to invest first. If we need an American investor, French or German or British, we also need our diaspora from those countries to come and invest first. You know, no businessman wants to put a railway on a desert. You need a layer prior to railway, and that layer can be put by our diaspora. Only in Germany, I think, there are over 30,000 Albanian businesses, but not only from Kosovo. Mm-hmm. And if 1% of them would come back and invest here, we would have 10 investors per municipality, and economic landscape would change forever. And this is what we advocate. But without having any illusions. There is no magical stick with which you become attractive for foreign investment. Mm-hmm. It is your own development which makes you attractive for investments which bring about further development. 90% of FDI in the world goes to already developed countries. Right. But people are leaving, Janusz, because money has left. 1.7 billion of our pensionist trust fund is 90% outside. The savings of Kosovars are 3.2 billion euros, and the loans altogether are 2.7 billion euros. Out of 10 banks, 8 are foreign banks. So in a way, when money leaves, people leave as well. And we need also some capital accumulation, some labor-intensive investments in order to bring hope and keep youth in our country.
In terms of larger scale investments, what are the attractions for potential investors from the international community here in Kosovo? Which sectors?
Well, of course, I think mines and minerals, Trepča, but also we have a lot of lignites. Mm-hmm. It's up to 14 billion tons of lignites, mm-hmm. which can be extracted quite easily. And Trepča is something that we should invest. For example, capital investments in Trepča for the year 2018 and 2019 are zero. Once you are in the government, you show love with budgets. You cannot say that I love Trepča and invest nothing. If we would invest in Trepča around 200 million euros, according to our experts in our movement, we could benefit a lot because Trepča is quite rich, not only with zinc and lead, but also with these rare earth metals like germanium, indium, and gallium, which are used for touchscreen devices. And in this way, we would increase employment, but we could export final products and semi-final products up to €500 million. So I think it's important to invest in Trepča, and revitalization of Trepča could also help unification of town of Mitrovica, because I don't think Mitrovica is divided because of the river, but because of the Trepča.
So, I mean, I've heard this for 20-odd years about the mineral wealth and how this could benefit Kosovo. What's holding investment back? What's holding the government back? Is it the fact of unresolved territorial status in the northern part of Kosovo? Is it the dispute with Serbia? What's holding the government back from investing in this?
Well, we have had all these governments who are very similar to the figure of hunters who want fast return. And Trepča is not that. They want fast return, they do asphalt. We need a government of farmers rather than a government of hunters. And government of farmers would sow this year to do the harvest next year. And we never had a government who knew where the country will be in 6 months' time. And I think this is the key liability impediment for our economic development. It's not the security and political problem. Of course, I do not deny that either. But I think that you could win over Serbs in the north once you decide to invest in Trepča. But that has never been tried.
That's a good segue, because I want to come into the Serbian community, Serbian minority question. Local elections are going to be held in the 4 northern municipalities on May 19th, after this resignation of 4 mayors. Can you explain why Veta Vendosija recently refused to certify, I think, 3 of the 4 candidates from the Srpska lista for the mayorship?
First of all, if you see the text of their resignation is as if you're reading a document of the year 1989. So it seems like a 30 years old document. And this is unacceptable. And we really need their public like distanciation from these resignations, because the same people will run again. So if you see what they think about our independence at our institutions, it's like, you know, they are explicitly saying that we are running to sabotage you. So this is not acceptable. On the other hand, they have publicly said that once they win, they're going to resign immediately. So there is needed some distanciation. However, we're not against Serb minority. On the contrary, I have a lot of Serbs in Kosovo that I communicate and even I meet with them, but who do not dare speak publicly because parallel structures, a phone call from Belgrade intervenes immediately. So that's why we didn't vote against certification of Serbian list, but we abstained. We wanted just to show that we cannot continue as if nothing happened, and as if they are not publicly saying that they are going to sabotage Republic of Kosovo once they are in office. And I really also doubt that they might, once they are in office, they might use that to, I don't know, have a certain new declaration of the 4 municipalities in the north, getting closer to Serbia and away from Kosovo. And that's why they want to refresh their legitimacy, because they have something in mind. I'm not sure at all that they would resign once in office. On the contrary, I think that this time, once they win those offices, they are going to use that in order to have their own autonomy or to practically enact some Bosniazation of Kosovo, since their Zajednica project, Association of Serb Majority Municipalities, failed because of the opposition in Kosovo and a constitutional court ruling.
Have they been boosted by this talk of partition, territorial exchange over the past year? In other words, the more we talk about this, the more there appear to be discussions about this between Belgrade and Pristina, the more it encourages those that favor autonomy and eventual separation from Kosovo.
Definitely. I think this idea of territorial exchange, land swap, was a call for all chauvinists in the Balkans to engage in a new era where simply you can start a third Balkan war. That was it about. And I think it came from Belgrade. Belgrade wants delimitation, they call it razgraničenje, delimitation, with Albanians via partition of Kosovo, in order to continue with delimitation with Croats via partition of Bosnia. This is the Belgrade plan. After they destroyed Yugoslavia, because through Yugoslavia they couldn't create Greater Serbia, so they wanted to destroy it in order to create Greater Serbia, they want now to destroy all the republics which came out of the process of disintegration of former Yugoslavia. They want to destroy Montenegro, they want to destroy Macedonia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia, they cannot. So I think in this Western Balkan 6, strangely, only Albania is safe, because it's surrounded by Albanians. And I think all other republics are in danger from Belgrade. If you read again the speech of President Vučić of September 2018, you see that he is lamenting for losses of Milosevic, not for his criminal project and criminal deeds that his troops did in Kosovo, Bosnia, but also Slovenia and Croatia earlier on.
So you and Vetevendosje are against any kind of territorial swaps between Serbia and Kosovo?
I think two feudal leaders, President of Kosovo and President of Serbia, think as if territories of these two countries are their private property, and like in medieval times, they can exchange things. But that's not doable in 21st century and when you have a parliamentarian democracy. So we are going to stop them. And I think that their project failed, but their idea still did not die. So we should be happy, but still careful.
And what should be the status of the Albanians in Preševo, some of whom do support joining Kosovo?
Well, of course, they had a referendum in 1992. They had the liberation war, which didn't bring much results, unfortunately. I think reciprocity as a principle of bilateral relations between Kosovo and Serbia is the way forward. You know, I cannot believe to people who promise us that Preševa, Bujanovac, and Medvedja will join Kosovo when they negotiated for 6 years in Brussels and never rose this issue. For example, why not in Bujanovac Albanians have their university? Our president, when he was prime minister back then in years 2011, 2017, or deputy prime minister, he never asked from Belgrade's side for Albanians to have a university in Bujanovac. And I think that the idea of land swap was counterproductive because it rendered passive Albanians in Valley of Preševa in relation to the chapters 23 and 24 of the negotiations for EU membership between Belgrade and Brussels. Because Albanians are the truth of Serbia. And they should speak out to Brussels what Serbia is doing in Preševa, Medvedja, and Bujanovac. But meanwhile, they are waiting for President Thaci to include them into Republic of Kosovo, which is not happening.
Coming back to the Serbian population in Kosovo, there seems to be no genuine opposition to Lista Srpska. Is this sort of political monopolization, would you say, in the Serb areas or amongst the Serbian community?
Yes, I fully agree. It's monopolization, but it's a violent one. It's not a peaceful one. Some years back, one assembly member of the political party of Slobodan Petrovic was murdered in the north. A bit more than a year, Oliver Ivanovic, the prominent leader, was also assassinated in the north. So the monopoly that Serbian list has is a violent one. And I think many among Serbs in Kosovo, Serbian community, they don't approve Serbian list, but there is a lot of influence from Belgrade through the media by giving second salary to certain people or by threatening you if you are not in line with Vučić. Strangely enough, being a Serb in Kosovo doesn't mean speaking Serbian language and having Serbian parents, but rather it means being loyal to Vučić. So they turned identity into loyalty to a certain person who is wanna be a king. And I think it's no wonder that in his speech in September 2018, President Vučić was speaking a lot about the future, but he was quoting despotic medieval leaders of Serbia like Lazarević, like Nemanja, or for that matter, Nikolai Velimirović, the bishop, who was very famous for his anti-Semitic stance.
What would be your prescriptions for better integrating the Serbian population into Kosovo's institutions? Presumably you've been opposed to the Zajednica concept because you see this as beginning of a sort of Bosnianization process in Kosovo. What would be your prescriptions?
I think we need dialogue from below, between Albanians and Serbs. So far, we have had closed diplomatic dialogue in Brussels with top-down approach. We need bottom-up approach where, let's say, Albanian farmers and Serbian farmers would get together in village Dobratin of Nenad Rašić in Lipjan, and there they would discuss about fertilizers, quality of seeds, about food processing, about agricultural market, about how state of Kosovo could subsidize farmers and so on. We need dialogue for development. I'm not in favor of dialogue for reconciliation because I don't need to reconcile with Serbs from Gračanica. They did nothing to me. Serbia needs to recognize independence of Kosovo and then reconciliation will follow up. The Serbs have a very famous historian, Latinka Perović. She wrote that for reconciliation you need trust. You cannot have reconciliation without trust. And the distrust of Albanians towards state of Serbia, not towards Serbs, is as high as ever. So speaking about reconciliation is utopian. We need recognition of our independence rather than reconciliation, and with Serbs of Kosovo, dialogue from below, because we need development. If you ask Albanians and Serbs, which are your two key concerns, none of them will say reconciliation. they will say jobs and justice. Jobs and justice. Anti-corruption and getting some working places, especially for youth.
But as you mentioned earlier, Belgrade itself has various, let's say, tools of influence or even control amongst the Serbian community in Kosovo. How does one counter that? How does one, let's say, convince Serbs that they should be more loyal to the Kosovo state, that Kosovo offers them something economically, socially, politically? How does one do that?
We have Albanians and Serbs, 20 years now, working together for international organizations, and we didn't have a single incident between them. In the late 90s, we did not fight because of our ethnic or cultural differences, but we fought because there was a contradiction in our interests. We wanted to stay in Kosovo, Milosevic wanted Kosovo without Albanians, and you had war. So if Albanians and Serbs can work together and get a decent salary, I think you would see communication and cooperation. This is what we need now. Paradoxically, the only multi-ethnic development in Kosovo is organized crime, because there is development. So we need development, and that is going to bring us together. And Albanians of Kosovo have no reason to fear Serbs, because they are like 5–6% of the population. So we never feared Serbs. We always feared Serbia because of their hegemonic appetites. You know, in the world, there are not only big imperialism, there are small imperialism as well, which sometimes are much worse. Because Serbia, in the name of fighting German imperialism of Nazi Germany during the Second World War, was dealing much more with its neighbors, Croats, Bosniaks, and Albanians, than with the Germans. And likewise, when Milosevic was fighting NATO, Milosevic was speaking against American imperialism, but actually was killing 10,000 unarmed Albanian civilians and raped 20,000 women.
One other question on the relations with Serbia, tariffs. What is your position on the tariffs question? You've been supportive in the past. Do you think that they've had a positive impact, both economically and politically?
There is no proper, official, credible survey of this, and we desperately need one. If we would be in the government, we wouldn't impose these tariffs, but we would start with the principle of reciprocity. Because even when you say 100% custom tax, this seems as if you have a prize. So we would more rely on principle than on barriers. However, now that our government has put this 100% custom tax, I think it should not be removed. Vučić is asking for it, but now it should not be removed. However, I advocate for the principle of reciprocity in political, economic, and trade aspect. Our president and our prime minister, they are divided around custom tax, but they are united around corruption. So I think what unites them is much stronger than what divides them. And that's why they are staying together. I think that we cannot continue all dialogue with Serbia, where she puts the agenda and we cooperate unconditionally. And we need principled dialogue, not dialogue without principles. And I don't see it starting anytime soon, at least before autumn this year.
So what conditions should be laid down for lifting the tariffs or reducing the tariffs?
I think that it is important to have an evaluation of those 33 agreements that we do have with Serbia. Let's not pretend as if we don't have agreement with Serbia. Actually, we have 33 of them. We should check their implementation and their impact and do an estimation, an evaluation of the 6-year dialogue. Afterwards, we should put a list of requirements towards Serbia. We consider Serbia to owe us a lot. And we, as government, as Assembly of Kosovo, as state of independent state of Kosovo, we should put some requests, some demands towards Serbia. Let Serbia put to us as well. But we need a sustainable agreement where we are going to have honesty and sincerity with each other. We think that you owe to us this and this and this. War damages, 120,000 houses destroyed. We have still 1,500 missing people, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, once we put this, we should have a platform for negotiations, but everything with two-thirds majority. We cannot divide among ourselves as Albanian political parties around Serbia. Serbia historically has been a factor which united us. For the first time, Serbia is something that divides us. President Thaci speaks of land swap and so-called border correction with painful compromise. We speak about territorial integrity and sovereignty. And this is very sad. And that's why the situation is still dangerous, because we have this new experience of Serbia entering as a wedge within the political scene of Kosovo Albanians.
And between Albania and Kosovo?
Yes. Likewise.
What do you see the role of the international community or the international players, let's say, in the negotiation process, dialogue process between Pristina and Belgrade?
I think that the Ms. Mogherini office and her personally did a lot of harm throughout these years, but especially in last year and this one, by facilitating the so-called land swap idea. She was desperate in having an agreement, and she was ready deliberately to make mistakes. Didn't care much about that. So for me, she was facilitating sort of a Munich conference part 2, 80 years later. And this is totally unacceptable. And soon she will be out of office, and I think this is good news for all of us. And it is important to know that Brussels, we expect not to facilitate anything. We expect Brussels to facilitate only things which are within the values of European Union and spirit of European Union. European Union relies on 3 main pillars. Peace with anti-fascism, Robert Schumann's speech on the 5th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany, 9th of May 1950, continental European welfare state, and NATO security umbrella. These are the 3 pillars. We should not give up on them. I know that NATO security umbrella is leaking. I know that welfare state is shaking. I know that peace with anti-fascism is not there in place, because there's some peace with fascism. For example, in Italy. But I think that we should not give up, and we should defend Europe and EU.
You don't sound like a Eurosceptic, EU skeptic. Presumably you want Kosovo to be part of the European Union.
I think that EU should include all the Western Balkan 6 at once, like they did on 1st of January 2004, when 10 countries from Baltic countries to Cyprus were included at once. I know that some people think that that was a mistake. I think the opposite would have been a much greater mistake, and we don't know where we would have been now, where we would be now if that wouldn't happen 15 years ago.
Very last question, Albin, because we're running out of time. US policy, do you see any major changes under the Trump administration as compared to previous? Towards Kosovo, I mean. I
think that the victory of President Trump in US is a victory of part of US foreign policy, which considers that the Soviet Union of 21st century is China. And I think this is the key thing. Everything else you can deduce from this. And we, as Republic of Kosovo, as Albanian nation, we have no substitution for US. There's no one who can replace US. I think that we should nurture our good cooperation, and we should, to every new administration that comes, with patience, explain our interests and how deep and big are our interest for the future. I believe that now it is important to have Kosovo's army, which still remains only on paper, even though we passed these 3 laws in December last year. And here is where we should add substance to our cooperation. US should help us get stronger to defend ourselves, not to attack anyone.
On that note, Albin, a number of issues that we should come back to, including the security sector, Russia, the region, and so forth at a future date. But thank you very much for a very, let's say, wide-ranging, interesting interview.
Thank you for this great opportunity.
Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues here at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshi.